There comes a moment, quiet, unannounced, when something shifts, not outside you, but in the way you are looking. And once that shift happens, once you truly see it, you cannot unsee it. Life looks the same, yet everything feels different. The world hasn't changed, but your relationship to it has. I want to speak from that place. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever noticed something so fundamental about yourself or reality that, once seen, made it impossible to go back to the way you were before? If you have, I invite you to share it in the comments below, because that recognition is far more common and far more important than we are taught to believe. Most people think awakening is about acquiring new information. They imagine it as a dramatic revelation, a cosmic secret finally uncovered. But what I am pointing to is much simpler, and for that very reason, much more unsettling. It is not about gaining something. It is about losing something specifically, the illusion that you are separate from what is happening. Here is a plain fact that we almost never examine. You do not experience the world directly. You experience your idea of it. You see labels, categories, memories, expectations, and you mistake those for reality itself. This is not a flaw. It is how the mind functions. But problems arise when you forget that you are doing it. Once you see this, you start noticing it everywhere. You realize that what you call me is largely a story, a narrative stitched together from memory, habit, and social agreement. You notice how often you defend that story, protect it, compare it, improve it, and suffer for it. And you begin to wonder, who is aware of this story? This is where things become uncomfortable, because the mind wants a solid answer. It wants a definable self it can point to and say, that's me. But when you look closely, not philosophically but directly, you cannot find such a thing. You find thoughts, sensations, emotions, memories, all appearing and disappearing, but the owner of them remains strangely absent. This is not a theory. It is an observation. And once you truly observe it, you can't unsee it. Notice how much of your daily life is spent trying to secure a sense of control. You plan, predict, worry, rehearse conversations, imagine outcomes. You do this because you believe there is a separate you who must manage life. But when you see that the manager is itself part of the process, something relaxes. Here is the argument I want you to consider carefully. The self you are trying to improve is the very thing that creates the feeling of being incomplete. This does not mean you stop learning or growing. It means you stop confusing growth with self-fixation. Once you see this, ambition changes, fear changes. Even success and failure lose some of their weight. Because you are no longer trying to prove your existence. You are simply expressing it. Think about how strange it is that you never question being conscious. You question what you should do with your life, who you should be, whether you are enough, but you almost never pause to marvel at the fact that experience is happening at all. This is the great oversight of modern life. The moment you truly see that you are not inside the world, looking out, but that the world is appearing within your awareness, the game changes. Not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. You stop taking your thoughts so literally. You stop assuming that every feeling requires immediate action. This is why people often resist this insight, because once you see it, you cannot blame reality for failing to conform to your expectations. You must take responsibility for the way you interpret experience. And that can feel like losing ground until you realize you were never standing on anything solid to begin with. I am not asking you to believe me. Belief is cheap. I am asking you to look. Right now, as you are listening to these words, notice that they are appearing in awareness. Thoughts arise, sensations occur, sounds happen, but where is the boundary? Where exactly do you end and the rest of life begin? Do not rush to answer. The mind will try to turn this into a conclusion, a statement, a position. But this is not something you hold on to. It is something you notice again and again. And here is the point that changes everything. Once you see that the self is not what you thought it was, you stop being so afraid of losing it. You become more playful, more curious, more present. Life feels less like a test and more like a dance. When this insight begins to dawn, the first reaction is often resistance. Not because it is false, but because it undermines something you have been relying on for a very long time. The sense of being a separate self, a thinker inside the head, a controller behind the eyes, feels essential. It feels like survival. And so the ego tightens its grip. Here is a fact worth sitting with. The ego is not an enemy. It is a useful social function. It helps you remember your name, keep appointments, and follow rules. But the trouble begins when you confuse this function with your true nature. You begin to believe you are the mask rather than the face behind it. Society depends on this confusion. Institutions, economies, and systems of reward all assume that you are an isolated unit competing with other isolated units. You are taught to compare, to measure, to rank yourself. And the more you identify with that process, the more anxious you become because isolation is frightening. Once you see this, you start noticing how much of your fear is learned. You were not born afraid of not being enough. You were taught that. You were trained to believe that value must be earned, defended, and displayed. And so you spend your life polishing an image that was never solid to begin with. This is why the realization feels dangerous, because if you are not fundamentally separate, then the entire game of comparison collapses. Winning and losing lose their absolute meaning, and the ego interprets that as annihilation. But look more closely. What actually disappears when you stop clinging to the image of yourself? You still function. You still think, speak, work, and create. What disappears is the constant background tension, the need to justify your existence. This is not an argument for withdrawal from the world. It is an argument for participation without psychological armor. When you are no longer obsessed with protecting a self-image, you can listen more deeply, act more honestly, and respond more creatively. Consider how often you say "I," as if it refers to a single, stable thing. Yet your thoughts change, your moods shift, your body ages. The I you were 10 years ago is not the I you are now, and still something remains that notices the change. That noticing has been there the whole time. Once you see this, suffering begins to look different. Pain still happens, but it is no longer compounded by the story of, why is this happening to me? There is just what is happening, and that simplicity is not cold, it is compassionate. The great misunderstanding is that seeing through the ego will make life empty or meaningless. In fact, the opposite occurs. Life becomes more intimate. Colors feel brighter, sounds richer, moments fuller, not because they have changed, but because you are no longer standing apart from them. This is why I say you can't unsee it. Because once you notice that the sense of separation is an assumption rather than a fact, you begin to catch it in action. You see how the mind creates distance, labels experience, and then reacts to its own labels. Here is a direct invitation. The next time you feel offended, threatened, or anxious, pause and look. Ask yourself, what exactly is being defended right now? Can you find it? Or do you find only thoughts claiming ownership? This is not about suppressing emotion. It is about seeing through confusion. And clarity, when it arrives, is gentle. It does not shout, it simply reveals. As this understanding deepens, you may notice a subtle shift in your relationship with time. The future loses some of its tyranny. The past loosens its grip. You are not trapped in the story of who you were or who you should become. You are available to what is happening now, and this availability is freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom from compulsive self-concern, the freedom to let life move through you without constant interference. When this understanding settles in, even quietly, it begins to touch the most ordinary parts of life. Work, for instance, stops being a battlefield where you prove your worth. It becomes an activity, a movement, something life is doing through you. You still make effort, but the effort is no longer fueled by fear. It is fueled by interest. Relationships change in the same way. When you are no longer desperately defending an image of yourself, you can actually meet another human being. You listen without preparing a response. You speak without rehearsing a performance. Love becomes less about possession and more about recognition, the recognition that what you are looking at is not fundamentally different from what you are. This is not sentimental. It is practical. Much conflict dissolves when you see that the other person is acting from the same confusion, the same conditioning, the same desire to be secure. Compassion stops being a moral obligation and becomes a natural response. Even fear of death looks different once you see this clearly. What is it exactly that you are afraid of losing? The body will change, certainly. The personality will dissolve. But the awareness that has been present throughout your life, the awareness in which all experiences appeared, has never been threatened by change. It has only ever known transformation. This does not require belief in an afterlife. It requires observation. Every night, the sense of me disappears in sleep, and yet you do not fear it. You wake up refreshed. Death is not the opposite of life. It is the opposite of birth. And life continues. Once you see this, urgency softens. You stop living as though time is running out in a personal sense. Instead, you feel invited to participate fully, now, without postponement. The present moment no longer feels like a means to an end. It feels sufficient. Responsibility, too, takes on a new meaning. You are not responsible for controlling the universe. You are responsible for responding honestly to what is in front of you. And honesty becomes easier when you are not constantly protecting an idea of yourself. This is why seeing this does not make you passive. It makes you precise. You act when action is needed. You rest when rest is natural. You speak when speaking is appropriate. And you stop forcing yourself to be someone you are not. Once you see it, you also notice how often suffering comes from resistance to what already is. You argue with reality, hoping it will change its mind. But reality does not negotiate. It invites cooperation, and cooperation is far more effective than control. So the phrase "you can't unsee it" is not a warning, it is an opening. It means that once you notice the illusion of separation, life becomes transparent, not simpler, but clearer, not easier, but more honest. You may still forget. That is natural. The habit of identification is strong. But each time you remember, each time you notice that you are not the thought, not the role, not the image, there is a quiet return, a sense of being at home in the middle of whatever is happening. And so I leave you with this final invitation. Do not try to hold on to this insight. Let it come and go. Watch how it appears in moments of stillness, in moments of laughter, even in moments of confusion. Seeing is not something you do once. It is something that keeps happening because the truth is not hidden. It is obvious, so obvious that you overlook it. And once you truly see it, you don't need to convince anyone else. You simply live differently.